Before we can even begin to understand the tangled and often heartbreaking story of the modern conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, we have to rewind the clock. Let's go back to a time before World War I, before the British Empire drew lines on maps that would change millions of lives forever. For about 400 years, from 1517 all the way up to 1917, the region we now call Israel and Palestine was a part of a much larger political entity. It was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, a vast and long-lasting empire with its capital in what is now Istanbul. This wasn't a nation-state in the way we think of countries today. It was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that ruled over diverse populations across the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeastern Europe. During this long period of Ottoman rule, the people living in the land, which the Ottomans administered as several districts, not one single province called Palestine, were a mix of communities. The majority of the population was Arab, most of whom were Muslim. But there were also significant Christian Arab communities and a small but deeply rooted Jewish population. These groups generally coexisted, not always in perfect harmony, as is often the case in history, but within a shared imperial framework. Their identities were often more local or religious than national. A person might see themselves as a Jerusalemite, a Muslim, or a subject of the Ottoman Sultan before they would think of themselves as a Palestinian or a Zionist in the modern political sense. The late 19th century, however, brought waves of change that began to ripple through the Ottoman lands. In Europe, nationalism was on the rise. The idea that people with a common language, culture, and history should have their own independent nation-state. This idea began to spread. Among European Jews, a political movement called Zionism emerged, advocating for the establishment of a national homeland for the Jewish people in their ancestral land, which they called Zion, or Eretz Israel. At the same time, a sense of Arab nationalism was also beginning to stir among the Arab intellectuals and notables within the Ottoman Empire, who dreamed of independence from Turkish rule and the creation of a unified Arab state or several Arab states. So, as the 20th century dawned, the ground was already being prepared for a future clash. The Ottoman Empire, often called the sick man of Europe, was weakening, and other global powers were eyeing its territories with great interest. Two powerful nationalist movements, both laying claim to the same piece of land, were gaining momentum. The Jewish communities in the region began to grow as small groups of Zionist immigrants arrived from Europe, purchasing land and establishing agricultural settlements. This set the stage for a monumental shift, a collision of aspirations that would be unleashed when the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed in the fires of the First World War. The old order was about to be swept away, leaving a vacuum that Britain would be all too eager to fill. The First World War, which raged from 1914 to 1918, was a cataclysm that shattered empires and redrew the map of the world, especially in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire made the fateful decision to side with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, against the Allied powers, which included Britain, France, and Russia. This decision sealed the empire's fate. Britain, with its powerful navy and vast imperial resources, saw the war as a golden opportunity to dismantle the Ottoman Empire and expand its own influence in the critically important region that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Middle East also held the promise of a new and increasingly vital resource oil. Britain fought the Ottomans on several fronts, including a major campaign in the Middle East. It was here that they sought allies among the local populations. Looking to weaken the Ottomans from within, British officials began communicating with Arab leaders who were eager to break free from Turkish rule. The British encouraged an Arab revolt, famously associated with the British officer T. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia. They promised Arab leaders that if they rose up and fought alongside the Allies against the Ottoman Turks, they would be rewarded with independence and sovereignty over the Arab lands of the empire after the war. This promise was a powerful motivator for many Arab nationalists who dreamed of a great, unified Arab kingdom. By 1917, the tide of the war in the region had turned decisively in Britain's favour. British forces, advancing from Egypt, pushed north into the Ottoman districts of Palestine. In December of that year, General Edmund Allenby famously walked into the city of Jerusalem, signalling the end of 4 centuries of Ottoman control. The war officially ended a year later in 1918, with the complete collapse and defeat of the Ottoman Empire. The victorious Allied powers, primarily Britain and France, were now in a position to divide the spoils of war. The vast territories that had once been administered from Istanbul were now up for grabs, and the promises made in the heat of battle were about to be tested against the cold realities of imperial ambition. Instead of immediate independence, the former Ottoman lands in the Middle East were carved up by the European victors. The newly formed League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, created a system of mandates. Under this system, Britain and France were given temporary control over these territories with the stated goal of guiding them towards self-rule. France took control of a mandate for Syria and Lebanon, while Britain was granted the mandate for Mesopotamia, which became Iraq, and the mandate for Palestine. So, after fighting to throw off the rule of one empire, many Arabs in the region found themselves under the control of another. This was the beginning of a new and deeply contentious chapter for the land and its people. The British mandate for Palestine was complicated from its very inception by a series of conflicting commitments that Britain had made during the war. It was a classic case of a powerful empire trying to be all things to all people in order to achieve its strategic aims, a policy that would ultimately lead to decades of bitterness and violence. On one hand, as we've seen, the British had cultivated the Arab revolt by making promises of independence to Arab leaders. These promises were laid out in a series of letters between 1915 and 1916 known as the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, which seemed to imply that Palestine would be included in the area of Arab independence. This gave Arab nationalists every reason to believe their aspirations for sovereignty would be realized. However, Britain was also courting another group, the Zionist movement. In an effort to gain support for the Allied war effort from Jewish communities in Britain, the United States and elsewhere, the British government issued a public statement in 1917. This statement is now famously, or infamously, known as the Balfour Declaration. It was a short letter from the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. The declaration stated that the British government viewed with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and would use its best efforts to facilitate this objective. This was a monumental victory for the Zionist movement, giving it the official backing of a major world power. The problem, of course, was that these two promises were fundamentally at odds with each other. Britain had seemingly promised the same piece of land to two different groups with competing national aspirations. The Balfour Declaration did contain a crucial caveat. It said that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. But for the Arab population, which at the time constituted about 90% of the people living in the land, this was hardly reassuring. They saw the declaration as a profound betrayal and a direct threat to their future, fearing that the establishment of a national home for one group would inevitably lead to their own political subjugation and displacement. As Britain began its administration of the Mandate for Palestine, it was tasked with the impossible mission of fulfilling these contradictory pledges. The British policy tried to juggle the two commitments, allowing and even facilitating Jewish immigration and land purchase, which the Zionists saw as essential to building their national home, while also trying to govern an increasingly restive and resistant Arab population. This created an environment of escalating tension. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the Jewish population in Palestine grew significantly, and so did the friction between the Jewish and Arab communities, leading to riots, protests, and outbreaks of violence. The British were caught in the middle of a conflict they themselves had helped to create. The political landscape surrounding Palestine was dramatically and tragically altered by the events of the Second World War in Europe. The Holocaust, the systematic state-sponsored genocide of 6 million European Jews by Nazi Germany and its collaborators, was a horror on an unimaginable scale. As the full extent of the atrocities became known after the war, it sent a shockwave through the conscience of the world. The persecution and mass murder of the Jewish people created a profound sense of sympathy and a widespread feeling that something must be done to ensure the security and survival of the Jewish people. The argument for a safe haven, a sovereign state where Jews could defend themselves, gained powerful new moral and emotional weight. This global shift in sentiment had a direct and immediate impact on the situation in Palestine. For the Zionist movement, the Holocaust was the ultimate, horrific proof of their core argument that Jews could never be safe as a minority in other nations and desperately needed a state of their own. Many of the survivors of the concentration camps were displaced, with no homes or communities to return to. They looked to Palestine as their only hope for a future. Clandestine and later overt efforts to bring these Jewish refugees to Palestine intensified, despite strict British quotas on immigration that had been imposed to appease Arab anger. The sight of ships filled with Holocaust survivors being turned away from the shores of Palestine by the British created a public relations disaster for Britain and further galvanized international support for the Zionist cause. For the Arab Palestinians, the situation was complex and deeply frustrating. While they were not responsible for the atrocities committed in Europe, they feared that they were being asked to pay the price for them. From their perspective, a European problem was being solved at their expense. They argued that the creation of a Jewish state in their homeland, which would inevitably involve the displacement of the existing Arab population, was a grave injustice. They felt that their own right to self-determination was being overlooked in the rush to address the tragedy of the Jewish people. Their political aspirations, they contended, were being sacrificed on the altar of European guilt. By 1947, Britain had had enough. The situation in Palestine had become ungovernable. They were facing escalating violence from both militant Jewish groups, who were fighting to oust the British and establish a state, and from Arab militias. The mandate was costing Britain dearly in terms of soldiers and money, and their international reputation was suffering. Unable to find a solution that would satisfy either side, and weary from its own post-war struggles, the British government decided to wash its hands of the problem. They announced that they would be terminating their mandate and turning the entire question of Palestine's future over to the newly formed international body, the United Nations. The fate of the land was now in the hands of the global community. So, with Britain stepping away, the United Nations took center stage. In 1947, the UN formed a special committee, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, or UNSCOP, to investigate the situation on the ground and propose a solution. This committee was made up of representatives from 11 different countries, deliberately excluding the major world powers to ensure a degree of impartiality. After months of hearings, travel, and deliberation, UNSCOP presented its findings. The majority of the committee members concluded that the national aspirations of both Jews and Arabs were, irreconcilable, and that a single, unified state was no longer a viable option. They believed that the only way forward was to divide the land. The committee's majority report proposed what is now known as the 1947 UN Partition Plan, or UN General Assembly Resolution 181. The plan recommended partitioning the territory of the British Mandate for Palestine into 2 independent states, one Arab and one Jewish. It was a complex and detailed proposal that meticulously drew borders on the map. The Jewish state was allocated about 56% of the land, which included the coastal plain and the Negev desert. Meanwhile, the Arab state was to receive about 43% of the territory, encompassing the Gaza area, the West Bank of the Jordan River, and the Galilee region in the north. The plan was an attempt at demographic and geographic logic, trying to create states with majorities of their respective populations. A crucial and particularly sensitive part of the plan concerned the city of Jerusalem. Given its profound religious significance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, the UN Committee proposed that Jerusalem should not belong to either state. Instead, it was to be designated as or a separate body under a special international regime administered by the United Nations. This was intended to guarantee freedom of access to the holy sites for people of all faiths and to prevent the city from becoming a point of conflict between the two new states. The plan envisioned an economic union between the two states to ensure that they could cooperate on issues like infrastructure, currency, and trade. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on the partition plan. It was a moment of high drama on the world stage, with intense lobbying from all sides. The resolution needed a two-thirds majority of the voting members to pass. In the end, the plan was approved by a vote of 33 to 13, with 10 abstentions. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two emerging superpowers of the post-war era, both voted in favor of the plan, each for their own strategic reasons. For the Jewish people and the Zionist movement, the vote was a moment of historic triumph, a validation of their long-held dream of statehood and a signal of international legitimacy. But the reaction from the other side would be entirely different. The response to the United Nations decision to partition Palestine was immediate and, honestly, starkly divided, laying bare the chasm that had opened between the two communities. For Jewish leaders and people in Palestine and around the world, the news of the UN vote was met with widespread celebration and joy. Crowds danced in the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. After centuries of diaspora and, the recent horror of the Holocaust, the international community had formally endorsed the creation of a Jewish state. The Zionist leadership, represented by the Jewish Agency, formally accepted the partition plan, viewing it as a critical step towards securing their national future, even though they were not entirely happy with all of its provisions, such as the internationalization of Jerusalem. In stark contrast, the Arab world reacted with uniform and vehement rejection. The Arab-Palestinian leadership, as well as the leaders of the surrounding Arab states, denounced the plan as a catastrophic injustice. They argued that the United Nations, a body they saw as dominated by Western powers, had no right to give away a majority of their land to a minority population of recent immigrants. They pointed out that at the time, Jews owned only about 7% of the land and made up about a third of the population, yet the plan granted them 56% of the territory. For them, this was not a compromise. It was a colonial act that violated the principle of self-determination for the indigenous Arab majority. The Arab Higher Committee, the main political body representing the Palestinian Arabs, declared that it would oppose the implementation of the partition plan by any means necessary. They felt that their very existence in their homeland was at stake. The leaders of Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Iraq, and Lebanon were equally opposed. They saw the creation of a Jewish state in their midst as a Western imperialist outpost that would destabilize the entire region. The Arab League, a regional organization of Arab states, announced that it would take action to prevent the division of Palestine. The rejection was not just political. It was absolute and uncompromising. It set the stage for an inevitable confrontation. Immediately following the UN vote, the simmering violence that had plagued Palestine for years erupted into a full-blown civil war. The period between the UN vote in November 1947 and the end of the British Mandate in May 1948 was one of intense and brutal fighting. Arab and Jewish militias battled for control of towns, villages, and strategic roads. Both sides committed atrocities, and the civilian populations suffered immensely. The British, in their final months, did little to intervene, focusing primarily on their own withdrawal. The carefully drawn lines of the UN partition map were already being erased and redrawn not by diplomats, but by the force of arms on the ground. The dream of a peaceful two-state solution was dying before it could even be born. As the British Mandate for Palestine spiraled into its final violent days, the Jewish leadership prepared to take a momentous step. The British had set a firm date for their departure, May 14th, 1948. At that moment, their authority would cease to exist, leaving a complete power vacuum. The Jewish community's leadership, under the guidance of its veteran leader David Ben-Gurion, decided that they could not wait. They believed that they had to declare their statehood immediately upon the British withdrawal, to establish facts on the ground and present the world with a sovereign entity. To hesitate, they feared, would be to invite chaos and potentially lose the opportunity that the UN vote had granted them. On the afternoon of Friday, May 14, 1948, just hours before the British Mandate officially expired, a gathering of Jewish leaders assembled at the Tel Aviv Museum. The ceremony was held in haste and under great secrecy, for fear of an imminent air raid. In front of a portrait of Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, David Ben-Gurion stood and read the Israeli Declaration of Independence. The document declared the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel. It promised that the new state would be based on freedom, justice, and peace, that it would ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. And it extended a hand of peace to its Arab neighbors. The declaration marked the birth of the first Jewish state in nearly 2,000 years. For Jews around the world, it was a moment of profound historical significance, the culmination of a long and arduous struggle. The new state was immediately recognized by two of the world's most powerful nations, the United States, under President Harry S. Truman, and just a few days later, the Soviet Union. This international recognition gave the fledgling state a crucial measure of legitimacy on the global stage. However, the declaration was made in the midst of an ongoing war, and its words of peace were met not with acceptance, but with the immediate promise of a much wider conflict. For the Arab Palestinians, the declaration was not a moment of creation, but one of catastrophe, an event they would come to call the Nakba. It was the formalization of their greatest fears, the loss of their homeland, and the beginning of their dispossession. They saw the establishment of Israel not as an act of national liberation, but as a settler colonial project that had succeeded with the help of international powers. The new state had been declared, but its borders were not yet secure, and its existence was not accepted by any of its neighbors. The stage was set for a full-scale war, a conflict that would determine not only the survival of Israel, but also the fate of the Palestinian people and the shape of the entire Middle East for generations to come. The day after Israel declared its independence, the predictions of a wider war came true. On May 15, 1948, the armies of 5 neighboring Arab countries, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded the territory of the former British Mandate. Their stated goal was to prevent the establishment of the Jewish state and to, restore law and order for the benefit of the Arab population of Palestine. The first major Arab-Israeli war, known to Israelis as the War of Independence and to Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe, had begun. The conflict was not just a battle for land. It was a struggle for national survival on one side and national preservation on the other. The invading Arab armies were, on paper, larger and better equipped than the newly formed Israeli Defense Forces. However, the Israeli forces, composed of various paramilitary groups now unified under a central command, fought with a desperate sense of purpose, believing their very existence was on the line. The Arab armies, on the other hand, were poorly coordinated, and their governments were often driven by their own rival ambitions, as much as by a unified goal to help the Palestinians. The fighting was intense and lasted for about 10 months, punctuated by several truces. Battles raged across the country, from the Galilee in the north to the Negev desert in the south, and in the contested city of Jerusalem. By the time a series of armistice agreements were signed in 1949, the outcome of the war was clear. Israel had not only survived, but it had won a decisive military victory. The new state now controlled significantly more territory than it had been allocated under the UN partition plan. Israel held about 78% of the former Mandate territory, including West Jerusalem, a large part of the Galilee, and land connecting the coast to Jerusalem. The remaining 22% was divided. The Kingdom of Transjordan annexed a territory that became known as the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Egypt, took control of a small coastal strip of land that became the Gaza Strip. The independent Arab state envisioned by the UN never came into being. The human cost of the war was immense and created a new and lasting crisis. During the fighting in 1948 and 1949, more than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes in the territory that became Israel. They sought refuge in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and in neighboring Arab countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. These refugees and their descendants now number in the millions, and their desire to return to their homes, what is known as the right of return, has remained one of the most intractable issues at the heart of the conflict ever since. The War of 1948 completely redrew the map and created a new, bitter reality that would define the region for the foreseeable future. The 1948 war did not mark an end to the conflict, but rather the beginning of a new and prolonged phase of hostility. The armistice lines of 1949 served as Israel's de facto borders for nearly 2 decades, but they were not recognized as permanent borders by the Arab states. No peace treaties were signed. The region remained in a state of unresolved war, punctuated by border skirmishes, terrorist attacks, and retaliatory raids. The Palestinian refugee crisis festered, with millions living in camps, their plight becoming a rallying cry for the Arab world and a source of deep-seated grievance. The core issues of land, sovereignty, and refugees remained completely unresolved, creating a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end. Major wars erupted again in 1956, 1967, and 1973, each one reshaping the political and territorial realities of the region. The Six-Day War in 1967 was particularly transformative. In a stunning military victory, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. This brought the remaining 22% of the original Mandate of Palestine under Israeli military occupation. It also meant that Israel now ruled over a large Palestinian population in the occupied territories, adding a new and complex dimension to the conflict. The war also saw the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, which became the leading voice of the Palestinian nationalist movement. Over the decades, there have been numerous attempts to find a lasting peace. The Camp David Accords in 1978 led to a historic peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, the first of its kind. The Oslo Accords in the 1990s created the Palestinian Authority and were supposed to be a roadmap to a 2-state solution, with an independent Palestinian state existing alongside Israel. These moments of hope, however, have ultimately failed to produce a final resolution. The Oslo process collapsed amid mutual distrust and a new wave of violence. Issues like the final borders, the status of Jerusalem, the fate of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and the Palestinian right of return have proven to be insurmountable obstacles. Today, nearly 8 decades after the UN first tried to partition the land, the conflict continues. Generations of both Israelis and Palestinians have been born into a reality defined by walls, checkpoints, military occupation, rocket attacks, and the constant fear of violence. A permanent, just and lasting peace that satisfies the national aspirations and security needs of both peoples remains elusive. The story of how maps are drawn and redrawn is often written in blood, and in the case of Israel and Palestine, it is a story that is still being written, with no clear final chapter in sight. The quest for a solution continues to be one of the world's most difficult and enduring challenges.